well documented that the CIA tested the effects of LSD on hundreds of unsuspecting subjects in the 1950s, and that the government withheld treatment from black syphilis victims during the infamous Tuskegee experiment. Not so well known is that many other Americans were used as human guinea pigs. Our program reveals how government agencies exposed millions to toxic chemicals and radioactivity without permission, and, according to critics, without regard for the potential dangers. Declassified documents reveal that from the end of World War II through the Cold War, hidden under a veil of secrecy, the U.S. government performed military tests on large populations. In the late 40s and early 50s, patients were injected with a radioactive substance while in their hospital bed.
See, my father never told me. I never knew that this happened to him.
Soldiers were exposed to radiation to test their performance in a nuclear war. In the 1950s, the Army released bacteria and chemicals at sea, in the air, and underground.
I found out that 4 of my pals that lived directly across the street from me had all died of cancer. These are 4 separate families.
In 1995, a presidential advisory committee confirmed that for more than 3 decades, hundreds of thousands of Americans have been unwitting participants in human experimentation.
It is a very, very important piece of America's history, and it will shape America's future.
Scientists have no First Amendment protection, none. They're not free to speak out anyway. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, there's a federal gag order. I want all your listeners to consider that. There's a federal gag order on all National Weather Service and all NOAA employees. I mean, how much more obvious is this situation? They're trying to plug leaks in the ship. And we have environmental scientists being fired all over. Canada's let go a huge number of their scientists. Australia has just fired 450 of their frontline environmental scientists. Why? Because they want to cover up what's happening in any way they can. And again, they're simply trying to obscure the severity of what's unfolding from the public as long as possible. So I would argue this again. If we don't take care of what's happening in our environment, in our skies right now, nothing else is going to matter. All these financial plans that people have and all their future aspirations won't mean anything soon.
He meets Rose. They get married, settle down, and raise a family. Over the years, John's health deteriorates, and he is diagnosed with Addison's disease, a chronic disorder of the adrenal glands that weakens him and leaves spots on his face. When World War II erupts in Europe, very little changes in John's life. He does not know that the Strong Memorial Hospital, where he is treated as an outpatient, has become part of the war effort. The hospital is being used for research by the Manhattan Project, the top-secret unit developing the atom bomb. The Manhattan team operates from inside this high-level security building across the street from the hospital. Only authorized personnel are allowed in.
Research was determined entirely within the Manhattan Project itself, and it might be determined by Manhattan Project scientists here in Rochester, or it might be the result of directives that came down from Los Alamos or from Oak Ridge, which is where the medical chief was headquartered. The university would have no ability to look at what kind of research was being done here.
John Musso, like all other patients at the hospital, is oblivious to the government's top-secret activity, and he continues with his routine visits to see his doctor for treatment. In 1945, the war ends. As Allied troops liberate the death camps, the world learns about the horrific experiments conducted by Nazi doctors on prisoners in the camps. Experiments that almost always resulted in cruel and painful death.
That they were war crimes, that these Nazi doctors could have been tried for murder, was eminently clear. But the Americans had the ambition, not simply of condemning a war crime, but of condemning a war crime committed in the name of medicine.
When the War Crime Tribunal is set up in Nuremberg to bring Nazi criminals to justice, special attention is given to these doctors and the experiments they conducted on humans. result is the formulation of the Nuremberg Code, a universal rule of conduct regarding any human experimentation in years to come.
The first principle, critical principle, of the Nuremberg Code is you don't get to do research on anyone without their permission. The voluntary consent of the subject. Now, obviously, the victims of the Nazi experiments had not given their consent, and Nuremberg quite wonderfully lays out consent as the bedrock principle for human experiment.
Not long after the end of World War II, the American public is drawn into the fervor of the Cold War.
Let's face it, the threat of hydrogen bomb warfare is the greatest danger our nation has ever known. Enemy jet bombers carrying nuclear weapons can sweep over a variety of routes and drop bombs on any important target in the United States. The threat of this destruction has affected our way of life in every city, town, and village from coast to coast.
The nuclear race towards a superior atomic bomb pushes research into new frontiers, and with it reaches a new dimension in human experimentation. Between 1951 and 1963, the United States conducts 925 tests of atomic and hydrogen bombs in the atmosphere and at underground sites in the Nevada desert. It has been established from government declassified records that as many as 200,000 military personnel participated in these tests. Among them, 3,000 serve at the test site as subjects of research. The military wants to find out how troops perform in a nuclear battlefield. Almost all of them are soldiers who have followed orders given by their superior officers. Very few are actually asked to volunteer. With her lawyer, Pat follows up on Chuck's revelation about his exposure to radiation. Trying to gain access to classified information would become an agonizing and an uphill battle with the federal government. It takes Pat years of research and legal proceedings just to obtain her husband's military and medical records. She is not alone. Thousands of other families of atomic veterans spend years requesting declassification of government records, trying to prove that they qualify for compensation.
The government is waiting for us all to die. Most of the men have already died, or they're on their way. There's a lot of widows that have died. We're all old. The women don't know the history of this whole thing. There are no records, and when they ask for compensation, for disability and indemnity compensation from the VA, they say, prove it. They've got the documents. We don't have the documents. They've got the proof. We don't have the proof.
The military establishment's fear of a nuclear war couples later on with fear of biological and chemical war. What if the Soviets spread deadly bacteria over highly populated areas, or spray into the air invisible chemicals that can kill thousands on contact? A decision is made in high places. Tests are needed. The invisible attack would probably have gone undetected, but something goes terribly wrong. A few days after, 11 people are admitted to the Stanford Medical Center in San Francisco. They are all suffering from a severe bacterial infection. One of the patients, Advner, dies.
I was 9 years old in 1950 when he died. My mother was a nurse. She was actually helping to attend to him. And it was a terrible sickness. He was going from high fevers to chills. He had hallucinations. And so it was a very, very serious infection and fever that was causing all that in him.
Francisco is not the only city targeted for a simulated biological attack. Declassified documents show that 2 years later, a similar test on a much larger scale takes place in Minneapolis.
This is the house I grew up in. This is 29th and Clinton. The school is behind me, about a block and a half. I played on the playground. All of my friends were in the neighborhood. It was a very middle-class working neighborhood. Most of our mothers stayed at home. We were the typical 50s housewives. Our fathers were working. We were in and out of each other's houses all the time, running in and out the way children will do. It was a very nice, safe, secure neighborhood.
In the summer of 1952, the Army turns this safe and secure environment into a testing ground, simulating an attack with bacteriological weapons. During a 3-month period, from 8 in the morning until midnight, hundreds of military personnel spray clouds of zinc cadmium sulfide over Minneapolis.
Zinc cadmium sulfide is a material that's totally synthetic. It was created specifically for the purpose of doing these types of experiments because it was completely different from anything else that was in the air.
The airborne powder is sprayed from trucks in the streets and from canisters on rooftops in both commercial and residential areas. The Army then monitors how far it travels and where it lands. No one is exempt from exposure to the zinc cadmium sulfide particles, and the Clinton Elementary School, no longer in existence but similar to this school, is one of the targets the Army subjects to massive spraying day after day.
It was a day that many were waiting for, a chance to tell the scientists about health.
In 1977, KTCA, a public television station in Minneapolis, breaks the story about the Army test, focusing attention on alleged high rate of health problems at the Clinton school.
My first reaction was disbelief. I thought, no, never. This is not true. I was in denial for many, many months, and during that denial time, I was really determined. I'm going to find out everything about this.
She is not alone. Public hearings soon follow.
Necessarily the optimal risk assessment.
Many come to hear testimonies, to listen to the experts.
Total disclosure, and nothing but.
Diane's own memories start coming back.
I vividly remember being lined up, going into the music room. There was an older gentleman sitting in a chair with a light wand in his hand, and he was passing this over our bodies on the outside of our clothing. I started contacting my old school pals. I started keeping a list of illnesses. The bottom came for me when I found out that 4 of my pals that lived directly across the street from me on Clinton Avenue had all died of cancer. These are 4 separate families in no way related health-wise. They died within a year of each other back in the early 80s when these people would have been in their 40s. And I thought, well, this doesn't quite seem like a coincidence to me.
During her research of declassified documents, Diane finds that Army doctors came back to the Clinton school the following year, 1953. They found a high rate of asthma, respiratory problems, and some cases of pneumonia. A report of the Minnesota Health Department also found that in the same year, the rate of infant mortality in Minneapolis is unusually high.
Because no one was monitoring.
Just how many Americans have been sprayed from the sea, land, and underground over this 20-year period? Have there been other similar tests in later years? It is hard to tell. Many details are still kept under secrecy in classified government documents.
And responsible for had been the proximate cause for harm or danger to the lives of any of our citizens, then the government ought to be in a position to own that and also to compensate for it. Now, the first time I uttered those words, there was a firestorm. I had no idea that anyone would think that that was a bizarre or strange thing for a cabinet officer to say.
O'Leary's statement is so unusual that the national media picks the story up, and the Department of Energy is overwhelmed with thousands of phone calls each day. She starts an in-house investigation at the Department of Energy. The task is not an easy one. It requires a review of millions of documents in government archives and warehouses all over the United States. Many of them are still classified. O'Leary brings the issue before President Clinton, and in 1994 he forms a Presidential Advisory Committee to look into human experimentation with radiation. The committee does not investigate the bacteriological and chemical tests.
Why?
After a year of intensive work, the committee submits their report to the president.
If this committee's work is to mean anything, it has to be that 50 years from now, there does not have to be another presidential committee charged with investigating allegations of abuses of human subjects.
Why?
The report reviews the history of human experimentation and investigates ethical standards, but it fails to satisfy the expectations of the victims.
Essentially what the committee did was say these experiments are wrong, but no one is to blame. So they did not find one doctor or one institution guilty. And as far as this large community of people who had been abused and unethically used in these experiments, the committee recommended that only the families of the plutonium patients be compensated. They came out with a report that does have some good information, but families of people who feel that they were used in these experiments are essentially still at ground zero when it comes to getting these documents.
I think if I were on the other side, I'd be feeling the same thing. Especially since the experiment, the effort had begun with such lofty expressions of ideals from me, from the President of the United States, and from Ruth Faden, who chaired that committee. We overpromised because we were so naive. We didn't know the government couldn't and didn't know how to deliver. We were all very naive.
This morning I signed an executive order instructing every arm and agency of our government that conducts, supports, or regulates research involving human beings to review immediately their procedures.
Some new procedures are already in place. Human experimentation hasn't been limited to the United States. The British government recently admitted that millions were secretly sprayed with a toxic chemical in the 1950s and 60s. Military officials conducting germ warfare experiments thought they were spraying a harmless substance, but later discovered the chemicals may have contributed to medical problems. Critics accuse the government of gambling with public health.
Very poor stewards of our planet, Greg. There's no arguing that. We've decimated it from every direction. So, and I think, Fukushima is a huge example of that. I mean, the fallout and catastrophe from Fukushima is immeasurable and growing. We've cut down our forests. We've lost 55% of Earth's original tree cover, a 55% mortality rate. We've paved the planet, poisoned the oceans. I mean, where would we stop? But our single greatest disrupting and decimating factor would be climate engineering. And in regard, let's take ozone depletion, Greg. With the ozone layer, we've been told it was CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. But that appears to have been a red flag. And we have now enough data to prove that the greatest destructive factor by far on the ozone layer is geoengineering, disrupting the hydrological cycle, toxifying the planet. But we have government agencies, Greg, who are set up to hide this fact from the population, to mask it. All the data is